The old clock on the wall struck 8 in the morning. I opened my eyes and stared up at the ceiling of my small bedroom, where a thin web of cracks resembled a map of riverbeds. Another day had begun. For many people, that's a reason to rejoice. But when you're 74 and alone in the world, every morning is like the last. My name is Hamish Winthrop. I've worked all my life as a radio engineer at a telecommunications station in Aberdeen. A decent job that I loved with all my heart, but it never paid much money. However, my late wife Dorothy and I never complained. Our small house, modest vacations once a year, and evenings with a cup of tea in front of the TV were our happiness. And then something happened that I wasn't prepared for. 5 years ago, Dorothy left. Cancer, quickly and ruthlessly. Struggling to overcome the morning stiffness in my joints, I got out of bed. My apartment is located on the 3rd floor of an old building with no elevator. When Dorothy and I had decided to sell the house and move here, it had made sense. Why would we need all this space? Now every climb up the stairs was like climbing Mount Everest, but it was too late to change. I went into the kitchen and put the kettle on. My breakfast is not very varied. Oatmeal, toast with jam, and tea. Sometimes I indulge in a soft-boiled egg on Sundays, if I'm lucky enough to get them on sale. The pension I get barely covers utilities, food, and medication. Or rather, it would if it weren't for weekly visits from Perry and Octavia. Perry is my only son. Once a hopeful musician, he eventually chose a more practical career as a real estate broker. His wife Octavia owns a small beauty salon on the outskirts of Aberdeen. According to them, business isn't going brilliantly, but looking at their clothes, car, and jewelry, I would never say that. I sip my tea, looking out the window at the gray Aberdeen sky. Thursday, the day the pension comes in, and of course, the day my son and his wife visit. They always arrive in the evening, around 6, with the invariable box of supermarket cookies and news of my grandson, Keith. Keith is a talented boy, playing the violin since he was 6. I don't get to see him very often, mostly at Christmas or on his birthday. Too busy with rehearsals and lessons, Perry always explains. I miss my grandson. I remember as a little boy he loved to sit on my lap, listening to stories about radio waves and distant lands where we could catch signals. Now he's 16, and he seems to be all grown up now. I opened the mailbox and found there a notice of a pension coming in. Inevitably, the picture of the evening visit came before my eyes. Perry would be sitting in my worn armchair with his leg over my leg, talking about Keith's incredible talent, his success, the rave reviews from his teachers. Octavia, fixing her perfectly styled hair, would nod and sigh about the high prices of everything, from violin strings to notebooks. And then, as if in between, they'll get to the main point. Dad, you know those extra lessons cost a fortune. Or, there's an opportunity to sign Keith up for a master class with a famous professor from Vienna, but the price, and I will, as always, go to the desk drawer where I keep my bank card and give them most of my pension. Because nothing is too small for my grandson. Because I once spent too much time at work and too little time with my son. And now the guilt is eating me up, making me give the last of it. At my age, my stomach doesn't need much anymore. You can eat simpler. I can give up a new shirt, even though the old one is already frayed at the elbows. I can turn on the heat less often, even though my joints ache from the cold. All of this can be endured if you know your grandson has the opportunity to develop his talent. The day stretched on slowly. I went out to the nearest store and stood at the tea shelf for a long time, choosing the cheapest one. Dorothy and I used to love good tea. It was our little weakness. Now I buy the one on sale. On my way home, I met a neighbor, Mrs. Parker. She too is a widow, but unlike me, she is surrounded by children and grandchildren who really care about her. "How are you, Mr. Winthrop?" she asked, stopping with her shopping cart. "Not bad, thank you," I replied with the fake smile that had become my permanent mask when dealing with people. "Is your son coming over today? I saw him and his wife come by last week." "Yes, they promised to visit." "You're lucky to have a son, so caring." I nodded, unable to explain that they only cared about my pension, that they would never ask if I needed anything fixed in the apartment, never offered to help with heavy bags or a trip to the doctor. Back home, I began to prepare for the visit. Wipe the dust, although in my apartment with a minimum of furniture, it is almost never there. I put the kettle on and took out the only decent set Dorothy had left me. She always served tea to her guests in these cups, and I kept the tradition alive. The doorbell rang at 6 sharp. They are always punctual when it comes to money. Perry stood on the doorstep in an expensive coat, with Octavia holding a box of cookies behind his back. "Daddy, how are you?" Perry hugged me, but his embrace was superficial, lacking warmth. "You look a little pale. Are you eating well?" "Of course," I lied. "How's Keith? How are his classes?" Perry's face brightened, as it always did at the mention of his son. "Oh, you're not going to believe this. His instructor says he hasn't seen such talent in 30 years of teaching. He is progressing at an incredible rate." We walked into the living room, and Octavia immediately took a seat by the window, avoiding sitting down on my old furniture, as if afraid of getting her designer clothes dirty. "Mr. Brennan, his violin teacher, says Keith could enter an international competition next year," Perry continued. "But of course, that would require a lot of preparation. And special repertoire," Octavia added, running her hand through her perfect hair. "The sheet music of an author's works is expensive, and you need recordings of professional performances to analyze." I poured the tea into cups, noticing that my hands were trembling slightly. Not from age, but from the anticipation of the inevitable conversation about money. "I wish Keith could visit me more often," I said, trying to make conversation. "I miss him so much." "You know how busy these times are," Octavia answered quickly. "In addition to school lessons, he has daily music lessons. And on weekends, he often goes to master classes in Edinburgh." "Maybe I could come to one of his performances," I asked hopefully. Perry and Octavia exchanged quick glances. "Sure, Dad," Perry said uncertainly. "But all the classes are closed now, for students and teachers only. Preparing for the competition, you know. As soon as there's an open concert, we'll be sure to take you." I nodded, feeling the familiar disappointment. There was always a reason I couldn't see my grandson. Octavia set the cup on the table and cleared her throat, a sure sign that they were moving on to the main purpose of the visit. "Hamish," she was the only one who called me by my first name, though I preferred Mr. Winthrop from my sister-in-law. "We've had a bit of a situation." Perry picked up on it. "Professor Lloyd, a very famous violinist from London, will be giving a series of master classes next month. Keith has been recommended as one of his most promising students, but the cost—" He paused. "The cost is quite high." "How much?" I asked, already knowing that I would give whatever it took. £1,200 for a cycle of 6 classes, Octavia replied, plus travel and living expenses, since the classes would be held on weekends for a month and a half. I swallowed. That was almost my entire monthly pension. "We're contributing our share, of course," Perry added hastily. "But with the mortgage, taxes, and all the ongoing expenses—" I stood up and walked over to the secretary where I kept my bank card and the last of my savings. My hands were shaking again, but already from the realization that I would have to save money on everything for the next month. Maybe even put off buying my arthritis medication. "Here," I said, holding out the card. "There should be enough there. You know the PIN number." Perry's face lit up with a smile. "Thanks, Dad. You don't realize what an opportunity this gives Keith. Maybe one day we'll see him on the stage of the Royal Albert Hall." Octavia smiled her perfect smile too, but her eyes remained cold. "You are a true role model, Hamish, so supportive of your grandson's talent. Many grandparents would rather spend money on their whims." I almost laughed out loud at those words. My whims now were limited to the ability to eat properly and not freeze at night. After another half hour of talking, mostly about Keith's incredible prospects and the difficulties of modern life, they packed up. Perry promised to return the card the following week, after he'd paid for everything he needed for the workshops. When the door closed behind them, the silence in the apartment was deafening. I sank into a chair and covered my face with my hands. Once upon a time, Dorothy and I had dreamed of a peaceful old age, of trips we'd put off for later, hobbies we never had time for. Now my days are filled with loneliness and constant worry about money. But then I looked at Keith's picture on the mantel, his smile so similar to Dorothy's, his eyes burning with enthusiasm. Could I deny him a chance for a better future? Wasn't this what Dorothy and I had worked and saved for all our lives? I reached for my shopping list and pencil. Time to review next month's spending, Maybe cut back even more on groceries, forgo new medications. After all, joint pain could be tolerated. The main thing is that Keith will have the opportunity to develop his talent, even if Grandpa has to economize on everything. That night, I couldn't sleep for a long time. My mind was spinning with thoughts about tomorrow, about how to stretch the remaining pennies, about whether I would ever see the result of all these sacrifices. Would Keith remember my contribution to his success? Or to him, will I remain a distant old man he sees once a year? At the end of October, heavy rains hit Aberdeen. The dampness penetrated everywhere, making my joints ache even more. On days like this, I usually didn't go out unless absolutely necessary, but my food supplies were running low and I had to go to the store. Pulling on the old raincoat that had served me well for the past 15 years, I slowly made my way down the stairs. My knee crunched protestingly on the last few steps. Arthritis was becoming an increasingly persistent companion, especially after I'd put off buying new medication, giving the money to Perry for Keith's master classes. Rain drummed on my hood as I shaved down the street, trying to avoid the puddles. The damp wind off the North Sea was chilling me to the bone, and I mentally calculated how many days I'd have to keep the heat on to save on bills. Absorbed in my thoughts, I didn't immediately notice the man who called out to me. Hamish! Hamish Winthrop, damn it! Turning around, I saw a burly figure under a large black umbrella. It took a few seconds to recognize the gray-haired man as Malcolm Fraser, an old amateur radio club buddy of mine. I hadn't seen him in at least 10 years. Malcolm, what a reunion! I tried to smile, though the cold was already binding the muscles in my face. You're freezing, old man! Malcolm came closer, covering me with his huge umbrella. There's a cafe around the corner. Shall we go and warm up? My treat. In another situation, I would have refused. My pride wouldn't allow me to accept a handout. But the freezing cold and the prospect of talking to someone other than the cashiers at the supermarket outweighed it. The cafe was small, cozy, and smelled of fresh baked goods. We took a table by the window and Malcolm ordered us both hot tea and cinnamon buns. How are you, Hamish? He asked when the waitress had gone. How many years has it been? I heard about Dorothy. My condolences. Thanks, I nodded. It's been 5 years. How about you? Still at the radio company? Malcolm shook his head, taking a sip of his tea. Retired 3 years ago, but sitting at home isn't really my thing. I got a job as a caretaker at Aberdeen Music School, working 3 days a week. It doesn't pay much, but I like being around people. And the music, it makes the atmosphere special. A Berdeen music school? I've suddenly straightened up. The one on the high street? Sire, that's the one. You know it? My grandson goes there. Keith Winthrop plays the violin. Malcolm Schoen. Keith. Of course I know him. He's a golden boy, winner of the town competition. All the teachers love him. Winner of the contest? I asked, feeling something unpleasant tingle in my chest. Yeah, he won the Mackenzie Scholarship last year. Full free tuition through high school. Very talented kid. Your family must be very proud. I froze with a cup in my hand. Free tuition? But Perry and Octavia were taking my money every week for supposedly expensive lessons and workshops. Yeah, he's, very talented, I said, trying to hide my confusion. And disciplined beyond his years, Malcolm continued, oblivious to my state of mind. He always shows up an hour before class, practicing in the spare classrooms. Sometimes I bring him tea and cookies when I do my evening rounds. How often does he have class? I asked, trying to keep my voice casual. 3 times a week in the evenings, plus orchestra on Saturdays. He's one of the few students who enjoys the full scholarship program, including one-on-one tutoring with Professor Brown. I nodded mechanically as my brain frantically processed the information. Everything my son and daughter-in-law had told me about extra paid lessons, master classes in Edinburgh, special notes. Was it all lies? And these individual lessons, are they free too? I cautiously clarified. Of course, Malcolm laughed. That's the whole point of the Mackenzie Scholarship, to give talented children from middle-class families every opportunity to develop. Keith is getting the best education he can find in Scotland, and it's all absolutely free. I could feel the color of shame flooding my face. All these months, all these years, I had given my last pennies, denied myself everything I needed, believing I was helping my grandson. But in reality, "Hamish, are you all right?" Malcolm asked worriedly. "You look pale." "Yeah, I'm just, a little tired from walking in the rain," I lied. "And this school, do you know if they accept donations from individuals?" "Of course they do. They have a special support fund. Many parents and relatives of alumni donate money. Do you want to support Keith's school?" "Maybe," I nodded. "Who can I ask for details?" Mrs. Dixon. She's in charge of administration. A call to the school would be enough." We sat in the cafe for another hour or so, reminiscing about old times in the radio club and mutual acquaintances. But my thoughts were far away. I could barely contain my anger and frustration, thinking about how long and cynically I had been deceived by the people closest to me. When I got home, I went straight to the phone. The answering machine light was blinking. Perry had left a message saying he'd stop by tomorrow to discuss something important. Another levy, no doubt. I dialed the music school number Malcolm had written down for me on a napkin. After a few beeps, a woman's voice said, "Aberdeen Music School, how can I help you?" "Good afternoon," I said, trying to make my voice sound confident. "I'd like to speak to Mrs. Dixon about the possibility of making a donation." "I'll put her through." A few seconds later, a businesslike woman's voice came through the phone. "Elizabeth Dixon speaking." "Hello, my name is—" I hesitated for a second, deciding not to give my last name. "Malcolm Fraser. I am interested in supporting the talented students of your school and would like to learn about possible donation programs." "That's a very admirable desire, Mr. Fraser," Mrs. Dixon said. "We have several programs. You can support the school as a whole, a specific area, or a specific student." "I'm interested in supporting a specific student," I said. "I heard about a young violinist named Keith Winthrop. Is it true that he is very talented?" "Oh, Keith is our pride," Mrs. Dixon's voice was full of genuine admiration. "One of the most gifted students we've had in years. Last year he won the Mackenzie Scholarship, which fully covers his tuition." "That's wonderful," I paused to quiet the tremor in my voice. "But does he need additional support? Maybe for competitions, master classes, buying instruments?" In fact, Mrs. Dixon lowered her voice as if sharing a secret. "The Mackenzie Scholarship is one of the most generous in Scotland. It covers not only tuition, but also participation in summer schools, master classes by visiting professors, even travel expenses to regional competitions." "What about Professor Lloyd's master classes from London?" I asked, remembering my son's latest legend. "Professor Lloyd?" Mrs. Dixon seemed puzzled. "I don't know of any Professor Lloyd giving master classes in Aberdeen or Edinburgh anytime soon. Perhaps you mean Professor Litwood? He came last month and Keith actually did a class with him. It was part of the fellowship program." "Yes, of course, Litwood," I muttered. "And tell me, if I wanted to help Keith with the purchase of a personal instrument or sheet music." "That's very noble of you, Mr. Fraser. But I must say that Keith already has a fine instrument, a violin provided by the Galway Charitable Foundation for Gifted Children. As for sheet music, our library is fully stocked with all the materials that pupils need. Of course, if you have a desire to support the school in other ways, we would be happy to discuss options." "Thank you for the information," I replied dryly. "Yeah, think about your suggestions and get back to you later." I hung up the phone and sank into my chair, feeling as if I'd been kicked in the butt. All these years I had been living on hunger, denying myself medicine, warm clothes, proper heating, and all for what? So that my son and his wife could live large at my expense? Bitterness and anger overwhelmed me. I remembered all those stories of expensive lessons, master classes, notes, trips to Edinburgh. All those complaints about the difficult financial situation, about how hard it was to support a talented child. All this time they were blatantly lying to my face. And Keith? Did he know what was going on? Or had he been lied to too, saying his grandfather was too stingy to help? The thought made it even more painful. My only grandson could think of me as a callous old man, while I was giving my last. I spent a sleepless night going over my options. Direct confrontation? But Perry had always been able to get out of any situation, ever since he was a kid. He'll make excuses, he'll pity me, he'll manipulate my feelings. No, I need hard evidence. In the morning, I counted my meager savings. There wasn't much left. It was all going to Keith's education, but now every penny would be spent wisely. I decided to start saving money, little by little, saving as much as I could. Not to give it to my son, but to find out the truth. 2 days later, Perry came as promised, this time without Octavia. He was especially courteous, even bringing a bag of groceries, a sure sign that he was going to ask for more money than usual. Haha, Daddy, you look tired, he said, setting the groceries on the table. All inexpensive, I noted with a bitter chuckle. Age takes its toll, I replied, watching my son with a new feeling, a mixture of pain and disgust. Listen, I've got great news. Perry sat down across from me, flashing that special smile he saved for big requests. Keith has been recommended for the international competition in Glasgow. That's a huge honor, and only a handful of people get such invitations. I looked at my son, at his enthusiastic face, and could not believe how easily another lie flew from his lips. Really? What wonderful news, I said, trying to keep my voice normal. Yeah, but there's one problem, Perry stepped forward. The fee for the participants is quite high, plus accommodation in Glasgow, transportation. I would never ask for it, but it's such an opportunity for Keith. How much, I asked, knowing that was the question he was expecting. 1,000 and 1,500 pounds. Perry had at least the conscience to look a little embarrassed. I know it's a lot, but Octavia and I will invest what we can. It's just that we're having temporary difficulties with the business right now. I stood up silently and walked over to the secretary. Not to the drawer where I kept my bank card, but to the other one, where the old photo albums were. I took out the envelope in which I had once kept important documents and took out 500 pounds, all I had scraped together in the last few months. Here, I said, holding it out. That's all I have. You'll have to find the rest yourself. Perry's face stretched. He was obviously expecting the full amount. But Dad, it's for Keith. You always said education was the most important investment. And I do, but my pension is limited and the bills are mounting, I said. Plus, I need new medication for my arthritis. Perry looked disappointed, but he took the money. His reaction confirmed my suspicions. He was only interested in the money, not my health or well-being. Thanks for that, he said with ill-concealed displeasure. I'll talk to the director of the contest. Maybe they'll come to our aid and lower the fee. After he left, I opened my notebook and carefully wrote down the date, the amount, and the purpose. Glasgow International Violin Competition. I began to keep such notes after my conversation with Mrs. Dixon. Every request for money, every story of necessary expenses was now documented. For the next 2 weeks, I continued my little investigation, called the music school under various pretexts, inquired about Keith's class schedule. I called the organizing committee of the competition in Glasgow and found out that there was no fee of 1,500 pounds and could not be. Participation is free for all invited participants, and travel and accommodation are paid by sponsors. Having given Perry 500 pounds, I was almost out of money, but I decided that this was the last money my son had fraudulently obtained. Now I was saving every penny, not for him, but for my plan. I needed to understand where my money was really going, to see for myself. After a month of daily austerity, I managed to save enough money to follow my son and daughter-in-law. I made a plan of action. Next Thursday, after receiving my pension, I would not wait for their visit. Instead, I would go to my son's house and conduct my own investigation. It's time to find out how Perry and Octavia are really living, while I'm counting every penny and turning down the heat to save on bills. The decision was made, and for the first time in a long time, I felt something resembling determination. It might be a little late to become a detective at 74, but age didn't matter to get justice. I believed that the truth would give me the strength to do what I should have done long ago, stop being exploited and regain my dignity. The day of retirement was surprisingly clear. It was as if nature itself had decided to support me in my little investigation. I was up early, long before dawn, despite the aching pain in my joints. I tried to eat breakfast, but I couldn't get a bite down my throat from the excitement. For the past month, I'd been carefully preparing for this day. I've saved on everything. I've eaten oatmeal and the cheapest bread, turned off the heat completely, walked only, even when my legs refused to serve, all for the sake of this day, for the sake of finding out the truth. On the table lay an envelope with the money he had saved, £153. It wasn't much, but it should be enough for a cab and any unforeseen expenses. Next to it was a notebook with notes on all of Keith's educational expenses Keith had made in the last few months. Master classes that didn't happen, competitions with made-up fees, special sheet music and strings that were actually provided for free. I looked at the clock, 3:30. Perry and Octavia usually arrived around 6 when their work was done, but today I wasn't going to wait for them. Today, I would go out to follow them myself. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, I left the apartment. I was wearing my best suit, the one I had left over from when I was still working. A little out of fashion, but still decent. In addition, I wore a hat to make me look less like my usual self. I didn't want to be recognized early. The cab arrived exactly at the appointed time. I dictated the address of my son's house, a 2-story mansion on the outskirts of Aberdeen. Too luxurious a house for a man who constantly complained of financial difficulties. "Any special instructions?" Dash asked the cab driver, a gray-haired man about my age. "Yes, please stop a block before the house. I want to, surprise you." The cabbie nodded understandingly, though a look of doubt flashed across his face. He probably thought I was one of those crazy old men who tracked down ex-wives or neighbors who stole garden gnomes. If only he knew how much more serious it was. "Here we are," the cabbie announced after about 20 minutes. "That house over there with the green roof is number 18. I paid and asked the driver to wait for me. He agreed for an extra fee. My savings were dwindling, but I had no other choice. I couldn't risk being without transportation in an unfamiliar neighborhood. Moving carefully along the hedge of a neighbor's property, I came to my son's house. In front of the house was their family car, a brand new SUV they had bought last year while complaining about their tight financial situation. Parked nearby was a sporty Audi, Octavia's new acquisition, which she had mentioned in passing, calling it a used small car. I settled down on a bench in the small square across the street from the house, partially hidden by the lilac bushes. From here I had a good view of the gate and driveway. The wait wasn't long. About 4 o'clock, the front door opened, and Perry and Octavia appeared on the threshold. Both were dressed as if they were going to a reception. My son in an expensive suit that clearly cost more than I'd spent on living in 6 months. Octavia in an elegant black dress and a new hairdo. They got into the Audi and pulled out of the driveway. I immediately hurried back to the waiting cab. "Follow that silver car, but keep your distance," I asked the cabbie, pointing to my son's car. The cabbie chuckled. "Just like in the movies. Is your wife cheating?" "No," I answered dryly. "Son." That silenced him, and we followed the Audi across town in silence. Finally, the son's car stopped outside the North Haven restaurant, one of Aberdeen's most expensive establishments. I knew about the place, though I had never been there. Dorothy and I could not afford such luxury, even on special occasions. "Wait for me here," I said to the cabbie, handing him another £20. "I don't know how long this will take." "No problem, friend," he nodded. "I'm in no hurry." I got out of the cab and slowly made my way toward the restaurant. My heart was pounding harder with each step. Part of me was still hoping for some reasonable explanation, that this was all a terrible misunderstanding. But deep inside, I knew the truth. The doorman opened the door for me, giving my old-fashioned suit a dubious glance. I entered a spacious room with dim lights, where waiters in white gloves glided silently between tables. The air was filled with the aromas of exquisite dishes and quiet piano music. "Do you have a reservation?" the maitre d' asked, eyeing me with disbelief. "Yea," I hesitated. "I'm looking for my relatives. They should be here." He arched an eyebrow, but didn't argue. I walked slowly down the hall, looking at the faces of the customers. Finally, I saw them at a large table by the window, in the company of 2 other couples. Perry was talking excitedly, waving his arms, and Octavia was laughing, her head tilted back. There were bottles of expensive wine on the table, plates of gourmet appetizers. I stood a few meters away from their table, hidden from view by a large ornamental palm tree. From here I could see and hear everything that was going on. "Every month," Perry said, pouring wine into glasses. "The old man doesn't even ask for an accounting. He just gives us everything we ask for. Perry, it's terrible, said one of the women, but there was more admiration in her voice than condemnation. What's awful? Octavia raised her glass elegantly. He won't spend that money wisely anyway. He sits in his den all day, doesn't go anywhere. And we have a growing child, a career, social obligations. And yet to deceive his father, said the man with the neatly trimmed beard thoughtfully. We don't cheat, Perry took a sip of wine. We're optimizing the family finances. What's the point of money lying around dead? Dad at his age couldn't spend half his pension even if he wanted to. We need it more. And what did you say he uses the money for? Asked another woman. For Keith's education, Octavia replied, picking up a piece of foie gras with her fork. Music lessons, competitions, master classes. The old man adores his grandson, is ready to give his last shirt. And we're just helping him be a good grandpa a little bit. The whole group laughed. But Keith is really talented, said the bearded man. We saw him perform last month. Oh yeah, the kid's a genius, Perry agreed with sudden pride in his voice. And he's got a great school. The Mackenzie Scholarship is a big deal, and the tuition is completely free. And the tools are provided, Octavia added. We don't even pay to rent a violin. And yet you're taking money from your father to pay for his education? The bearded man shook his head. Perry, it's business, Howard. Perry leaned forward. Just business. My father is a valuable asset that needs to be properly utilized. Speaking of business, how's your trip going? It's all booked up, the bearded man's wife replied enthusiastically. 2 weeks in St. Moritz. The best hotel, the best slopes. Are you sure you're coming with us? Of course, Octavia exclaimed. We've already paid in advance. Ski pass for the whole season, individual instructor for Keith. And the old man will pay for this trip? Ahnum, grinned the first woman. Let's just say, Perry raised his glass, the next big international violin competition will cost my father about the price of a week's stay in a 5-star hotel in the Swiss Alps. There was laughter again. I stood gripping the back of the nearest chair so hard my knuckles turned white. Every word rang out. Valuable asset. Financial optimization. Won't spend wisely. My own son was talking about me like a cash cow, like an ATM machine that could be cashed out at any moment. I had to walk away. The sensible thing to do would have been to quietly leave the restaurant, go home, and there, in peace, consider my next steps. But something inside me broke. 74 years of restraint, politeness, concession. All this collapsed under the weight of what I had heard. Without realizing what I was doing, I stepped out from behind the palm tree and headed straight for their table. When Perry saw me, he froze with his glass in his hand, his face twisted in amazement. Dad? What are you doing here? Hello, Perry. My voice sounded surprisingly calm, even though I was seething with anger. Octavia. Good evening to you, too. I nodded to their friends who looked at me with confusion. Dad, this is unexpected. Perry tried to smile, but it came out crooked. You never said you loved North Haven. I didn't say a lot of things, I replied, still maintaining a semblance of calm. Like what I knew about Keith's free tuition on the Mackenzie Scholarship, or that there was no Professor Lloyd, or about how the money I give you every month is actually spent. Perry's face went white. Octavia froze with her fork in her hand. Their friends squirmed uncomfortably in their chairs, clearly wishing they were somewhere away from this scene. Dad, I can explain, Perry began. Don't bother, I interrupted him. I've heard it all. Valuable asset. Financial optimization. Very impressive. How long have you been turning my pension into your supplemental income? Hamish, Octavia intervened, turning on her charm. You've got it all wrong. We do spend money on Keith, just not on his education. I finished for her, and on a ski resort in Switzerland, a new car, dinners at expensive restaurants. Perry's friends began to rise from the table. Perhaps we'd better leave you two alone, the bearded one muttered, giving my son a sympathetic look. No, stay, I said with a wave of my hand. You're aware of the situation, aren't you? You know how much fun it is to cheat an old man out of his last dime. I've really been saving on everything. Food, medicine, heating. so my grandson could get a better education. And it turns out he already has one for free. Perry jumped up, his face contorted with anger and fear. You've been following us? Checking up on us? You didn't trust your own son? Should I have? I asked, feeling my voice shake. All these years I'd given you money, believing every word, believing I was helping Keith. And you just used my love for my grandson to get money out of me. And we're spending it on Keith, Octavia exclaimed. Maybe not on music lessons, but on his closet, his entertainment, his trips. Your closet, your entertainment, your travels, I corrected. And all this time you've been lying to my eyes. And I was a fool to believe I was doing something good for my grandson. Hamish, please, let's not make a scene. Octavia looked around nervously. Several visitors of the neighboring tables were already watching our conversation with interest. Scenes? I grinned bitterly. Don't worry, Octavia, I'm not going to make a scene. I just want to know one thing. Does Keith know? Does he know that I'm giving you money for his education? Perry and Octavia exchanged quick glances. And that was enough for me to realize that there was something else, something I didn't know. Dad, Keith had nothing to do with it, Perry began. He what? What have you been telling him about me all these years? Perry swallowed, clearly hesitant to answer. Octavia suddenly showed interest in the contents of her purse. I'm asking you, Perry. My voice became firmer. What have you been telling my grandson? Why is he barely communicating with me? Perry gave up, sinking back into his chair. We may have given him a certain impression. What kind of impression? That you're not particularly generous, Perry admitted grudgingly. That you had to spend a lot of time explaining the importance of his musical education. That you're reluctant to help. Reluctant? I raised my voice, forgetting my restraint. I've been giving you almost my entire pension. I've been saving money on medicine. I was freezing in my own apartment because I couldn't afford proper heating. We didn't know it was that bad, Octavia muttered. Don't lie, I said. You saw perfectly well what conditions I was living in. But you didn't care as long as I kept giving money. And all the while you were turning my own grandson against me. Perry raised his hands in a protective gesture. Dad, we just didn't want Keith to feel like a burden. To make him think his education was a burden on the family. So instead, you made him think his grandfather was a greedy old man who didn't want to help? I shook my head. You've robbed me of my relationship with my only grandson. You've made him see me as a callous, selfish man instead of a loving grandfather willing to give his last dime. We can fix this, Octavia said hastily. Explain to Keith that there's been a misunderstanding. Misunderstanding? I almost laughed. You've been methodically deceiving me for years, taking my money under false pretenses, turning my grandson against me, and you call it a misunderstanding? Perry and Octavia's friends had almost left the table by now, mumbling apologies. Dad, Perry lowered his voice, let's discuss this at home. You're upset, I understand, but no, I shook my head. No more discussion, no more explanations, no more excuses. From today, everything changes. You won't get another penny from me, and I'm going to tell Keith the truth myself about how his parents used his father and grandfather. You wouldn't dare, Octavia hissed, showing her true face for the first time. You will destroy his relationship with us. You destroyed it yourself, I replied. Your lies, your greed, your contempt for me. Did you think I would blindly trust you forever? That I would never know the truth? Dad, think of your reputation. Perry tried to come at me from the other side. Dash our family. What will people say? I don't care what people say. All I care about is that I foolishly let you fool me for years. That because of you, my grandson thinks I'm a greedy old man. But that's the end of it. I turned to leave, but Perry grabbed my arm. Dad, please, let's just talk calmly. We admit we were wrong. We'll give you your money back if you want it. We'll explain everything to Keith. I released my hand and looked my son in the eye. You know what the saddest part is, Perry? If you just asked for help, honestly saying you needed the money, I'd have given what I could. But you chose deception. You chose to use me like an ATM machine to get the last of it. And for that, I will never forgive you. With these words, I turned and strode toward the restaurant's exit, feeling dozens of eyes following me. Behind me, I could hear Octavia hissing at Perry, blaming him for everything that had happened. And he snapped back. Their perfect plan had fallen apart, and now they were looking for someone to blame. Stepping out into the fresh evening air, I took a deep breath. A hurricane of emotions swirled inside: rage, anger, frustration, the pain of betrayal. But at the same time, I felt a strange relief. It was as if the heavy weight I'd been carrying for years had suddenly fallen from my shoulders. My cab was still waiting. The driver was dozing behind the wheel, but he perked up when he saw me. "Are you all right, friend?" he asked, noticing my condition. "You look like you've seen a ghost." "No," I replied, climbing into the back seat. "I just finally saw the truth, and it was much worse than I could have imagined." The cab pulled up in front of my house. I paid, leaving the last of my money behind, and walked slowly toward the driveway. My legs felt like I'd aged 10 years in one evening. Each step was difficult, but it wasn't the arthritis. The mental pain was much worse than the physical. When I entered the apartment, it felt even emptier and colder than usual. I turned on the light and sank into a chair without taking off my coat. I was dizzy from the shock of the experience, and the scene in the restaurant played over and over in my mind's eye. Perry and Octavia's smug faces, their cynical jokes, their confession of years of deceit. The phone rang almost immediately. I knew it was Perry, so I didn't pick it up. A minute later, the answering machine clicked, and I heard my son's voice. "Dad, please pick up the phone. We need to talk. What you heard it doesn't look like that. We can explain everything. Call me as soon as you hear the message." I continued to sit motionless. 5 minutes later, the phone rang again. "Dad," Perry's voice sounded annoyed this time. "You're acting like a child. Yes, we were wrong, but you're no saint. Where were you when I needed a father? Always at work, always with your radio waves. Maybe if you'd spent more time with me when I was a kid, I'd have grown up a different person. Think about it." I grinned bitterly. Even now, caught red-handed, he was trying to put the blame on me. Indeed, I worked hard when Perry was a child. Dorothy and I had been saving for his education, for our future together. I wasn't a perfect father, but I tried my best. The phone continued to ring at short intervals throughout the night. I muted it, but the red answering machine light kept blinking, accumulating messages. At one point, I dozed off in my chair and was awakened by a knock on the door. It was 9:30 in the morning. "Dad, open up!" Perry's voice came from behind the door. "I know you're home. We need to talk." I didn't move. The knocking grew more insistent. "Hamish, please!" Octavia was leaning against the door now, her voice honeyed and ingratiating. "We understand that you're upset. We've apologized and we're ready to discuss it. Open up. It's your family." Family? That's ironic. They only remembered the family bond when they realized they'd lost access to my wallet. "Go away," I finally said as I walked to the door. "I have nothing to say to you." "Papa, don't be a child," Perry exclaimed irritably. "Open the door. We need to talk like adults." "We talked about everything last night," I said. "That's all I have to say." "Hamish," Octavia rejoined, "think of Keith. It's not his fault. The boy loves you and misses his grandfather." The mention of a grandson made me shudder. They weren't afraid to use even that. "If Keith misses me, let him come to me by himself," I replied, "without your escort." There was silence outside the door. Then I heard a muffled conversation. They were obviously conferring among themselves. "All right," Perry said at last. "Keith will come to see you this weekend, but you must promise not to turn him against us." "I'll only tell him the truth," I said firmly. "Unlike you." Again, there was a tense silence. "Dad, you don't know what you're getting into." Perry's voice became menacing. "You're not old enough. What happens if you get sick? If you need help? Who's going to take care of you if not your family?" "Certainly not the people who've been stealing from me for years," I countered. "We didn't steal," Octavia protested. "We just misused your help. But we've come to our senses and we're ready to change." "Go away," I repeated. "I'm tired of your lies." "You're going to regret this, Dad." Perry's voice was a blatant threat. "We can make sure you never see Keith again. Think about it." I leaned against the wall, feeling my legs shake. They threatened to rob me of the companionship of my grandson, the one bright spot in my life. But something inside of me grew stronger. I was no longer going to be a victim of their manipulations. Do what you want, I replied. But know this, as soon as Keith turns 18, I'm going to tell him the truth, the whole truth, and let him decide whether he wants to hang out with the grandfather who tried to help him or with the parents who used his name to extort money. It got quiet again behind the door. Then I heard muffled footsteps. They were leaving. I sat back in my chair and closed my eyes. My hands were shaking. My heart was pounding like crazy. I'd never been a confrontational person, always avoided conflict, but now I had no choice. I spent the next 2 days at home, going out only for the essentials. The phone rang constantly, but I didn't answer it. The messages on the answering machine varied from angry accusations to tearful pleas and apologies. Perry and Octavia tried the full range of manipulative tactics, from aggression to self-pity, but I remained adamant. On the third day, I pulled myself together and went to the bank. I had to take a cab. My legs finally refused to serve. My joints were inflamed from stress and lack of medication. At the bank, I was met by a young employee with a friendly smile. "What can I do for you, sir?" "I need to close the joint access to my account," I explained. "My son should no longer be able to withdraw money from it." She nodded, showing no surprise. Apparently, such requests were not uncommon. "Of course, sir. You will need to fill out a form and provide identification." Half an hour later, it was done. I also opened a new account at another bank and transferred most of my remaining savings there. Not that there was much. Perry and Octavia had taken care of that. The next stop on my itinerary was the locksmith. The old locks in my apartment had been in need of replacement for a long time, and now there was a good reason for it. The locksmith promised to come the next day. When I returned home, I found the door unlocked. I wondered if Perry had used his key to break in while I was gone. Cautiously, I stepped inside, relieved to see that everything was in its place. I must have forgotten to lock the door on my way out. Age and stress had taken their toll. It was only as I settled into the chair that I noticed the envelope on the table. It hadn't been there when I left, so Perry had come after all. I opened the envelope with trembling fingers. Inside was a note written in Octavia's neat handwriting. "Hamish, we understand your feelings and are giving you time to calm down. When you are ready to talk, give us a call. We recognize our mistakes and want to make things right. Don't make any hasty decisions that could ruin our family forever. Love, Octavia and Perry." Next to the note lay a few bills, £500, a handout designed to assuage my anger, or rather, a payoff. I crumpled the note and tossed the money away. Too late for an apology, too late to try to make things right. The next day, a locksmith came and replaced all the locks. I ordered 3 sets of keys, one for myself, one to keep with my neighbor, Mrs. Parker, and one spare. Perry would never again enter my house uninvited. That evening, I found an ad in the local paper for the Aberdeen Senior Support Center. They offered legal advice, psychological counseling, and social support. Just what I needed right now. The center was located in an old former school building, renovated and adapted to the needs of the elderly. It was bright and cozy inside, with information posters and bright pictures on the walls, drawn apparently by children from a nearby elementary school. At the front desk sat a middle-aged woman with short gray hair and a penetrating gaze. "Good afternoon, can I help you?" she asked as I hesitantly approached. "Yeah, I need counseling," I began awkwardly. "Legal. Regarding financial relationships with relatives." The woman nodded understandingly. "You've come to the right place. My name is Fiona McLeod. I'm a social worker. And you are?" "Hamish Winthrop." "Nice to meet you, Mr. Winthrop. Tell me what's troubling you." I hadn't planned to spill my guts to a stranger, but there was something in her calm, attentive gaze that made me want to tell her. So I told her everything. About Dorothy's death, about the years of loneliness, about the weekly visits from Perry and Octavia, about their constant requests for money for Keith's education, about my investigation and the terrible discovery at the restaurant. Fiona listened without interrupting, only occasionally making notes in her notebook. When I finished, she took a deep breath. "Mr. Winthrop, I'm very sorry for what you've been through. Unfortunately, your situation is not unique. Domestic financial abuse is one of the most common forms of elder abuse, and it often goes unnoticed." "Financial abuse?" I interjected. That sounds so official. That's exactly what it's called, Fiona nodded. When a family member uses their position to gain control of an elderly person's finances, it's a form of abuse. And your case has all the hallmarks: deception, manipulation, threats of isolation from your grandchild. I never thought of myself as a victim of abuse. In my mind, violence has always been about physical abuse, but what Fiona was describing was exactly what my situation was. What am I supposed to do now? I asked, feeling completely lost. You've already taken the first important steps, Fiona said encouragingly. You've closed the account, changed the locks. That's the right thing to do. Now let's think about the next steps. She suggested that I talk to a lawyer at the center who specializes in protecting the rights of the elderly. Half an hour later, I was sitting in the office of James Hoggart, an older man with bushy eyebrows and an attentive gaze. James listened to a brief version of my story and got straight to the point. Mr. Winthrop, there are several legal aspects to your situation that are worth considering. First, you can file a claim for damages if you have documentation of the deception. I have records of all the amounts I gave and records of conversations with the music school. I said, that's good, but the legal process can be long and stressful. Given your age and health, it's worth weighing the pros and cons. I nodded. The thought of litigating against my own son for all my resentment was uncomfortable. Second, James continued, it's important to protect yourself from your son's possible attempts to gain control of your finances or property in the future, especially in the event that your health deteriorates. How can this be done? You can make a power of attorney for someone you trust, a friend, distant relative, or professional guardian. This power of attorney will only take effect if you are declared incapacitated. It is also worth reviewing your will. The will. I had almost forgotten about it. It was made years ago, while Dorothy was still alive. By default, all my assets were to go to Perry as sole beneficiary. Yes, the will needs to be changed, I said firmly. I don't want Perry or Octavia to get a penny of my inheritance. But my grandson Keith, he's innocent. In that case, we could set up a trust fund for your grandson, James suggested. The money would be available to him when he reaches a certain age or when certain conditions are met, such as paying for his education. The parents would not be able to access it. That sounded like exactly what I needed. Protect what little I have left from the greed of my son and daughter-in-law, but also secure Keith's future. And who would manage the fund? I asked. Not Perry, that's for sure. Usually an independent trustee is appointed. It could be a lawyer, financial advisor, or other fiduciary. Our center has a program where seniors can appoint one of our staff members as a trustee. We talked for another hour or so, going over the details. By the end of the meeting, I had a clear plan of action: change my will to exclude Perry and Octavia, set up a trust for Keith with an independent trustee, and execute a medical power of attorney for Fiona McLeod so that Perry could not make decisions about my care in the event of incapacity. As I walked out of the center, I felt a little lighter on my soul. For the first time in a long time, I felt that I was in control, that I was making decisions not under the pressure of guilt or manipulation, but out of self-interest and common sense. A surprise was waiting for me at home. There was a message from Keith on my answering machine. For the first time in many months, I heard my grandson's voice. Grandpa, it's me, Keith. Mom said you wanted to meet me. Yai, I want to see you too. Please call me when you can. He left his cell phone number. My heart felt warm, despite Perry and Octavia's efforts to turn my grandson against me. I could hear the genuine affection in his voice. The boy wanted to see me. I decided to call him tomorrow, when I'd gotten some rest and gotten my thoughts together. It wouldn't be an easy conversation. I didn't want to denigrate his parents in his eyes, but I wasn't going to continue living a lie either. For the first time in a long time, I fell asleep with a sense of peace and determination. I was no longer a helpless victim, dependent on the whims of greedy relatives. I was the master of my life again, and the first thing I was going to do was to rebuild a relationship with my grandson, a real relationship based on truth, not manipulation and lies. The next morning, I went to the notary's office to officially change the will. As James had advised, I excluded Perry and Octavia completely and bequeathed all my assets, my apartment, my savings, my personal belongings, to a trust fund for Keith to manage. The money was to be available to him when he reached the age of 21 or earlier, but only to pay for his education. I appointed a lawyer from the senior center as the trustee of the fund. As I signed the new will, I had mixed feelings. Bitterness at the necessity of such measures was mixed with a sense of justice and security. Perry and Octavia would never again have control over my finances. Not in my lifetime or after my death. A week passed after I changed my will. The calls from Perry and Octavia gradually died down. Apparently, they realized that the usual tactics were no longer working. However, I still couldn't get in touch with Keith. I dialed the number he'd left behind several times, but the phone always went to voicemail. This worried me. Perhaps my parents had intercepted my calls or forbidden their grandson to communicate with me. One morning, looking through the local newspaper, I came across a small ad. The Aberdeen School of Music invites students to a spring concert. The program includes works by classical and contemporary composers. Sunday, 3 o'clock in the afternoon, school concert hall. Entrance is free. My heart beat faster. This was my chance to see Keith without the interference of Perry and Octavia. I didn't know for sure if my grandson would perform, but my gut told me he would. Malcolm had said that Keith was the pride of the school and that such a talented student would be included in the program. Sunday was 3 days away. I decided to prepare properly. For the first time in a long time, I allowed myself to spend money on a new shirt and a haircut. I wanted to look decent so that my grandson wouldn't be ashamed of his grandfather. Sunday was clear and warm, as if nature itself was blessing my plan. I left the house 2 hours before the concert to get to the music school at a leisurely pace. My strength was failing, and long walks were difficult, but today I felt an unusual burst of energy. The Aberdeen Music School was housed in an old gray stone building. A wide staircase led up to the massive oak doors, above which hung a plaque with the school's name and coat of arms, a lyre framed by oak leaves. I arrived 40 minutes before the concert began, but a small crowd had already gathered at the entrance. Parents, grandparents, and friends of the performers. My heart squeezed for a moment. What if Perry and Octavia were here? But I immediately dismissed the thought. Even if they came, I had every right to be at a public concert. The school's lobby was lined with pictures of distinguished alumni and posters of upcoming events. Among the others, I noticed the announcement of the Glasgow Young Performers Competition, the same one Perry had bilked me out of the last of my money for. I grinned bitterly, remembering how easily I'd fallen for their tricks. The concert hall was a small but cozy room with a stage, a grand piano, and rows of chairs for the audience. I chose a seat in the middle row, not too far away, but not in full view. Gradually, the hall filled with people. The air was filled with the hum of voices and anticipation. At precisely 3 o'clock, an elegant middle-aged woman, apparently the headmistress of the school, took the stage. She welcomed the guests and introduced the program. I stared nervously at the printed program, looking for Keith's name, and there it was, the penultimate number. Keith Winthrop, violin. Johann Sebastian Bach. Chaconne from Partita number 2 inches. I could hardly concentrate on the other children's performances, although many were playing quite well. My eyes kept glancing around the hall looking for Perry and Octavia, but to my relief, they were nowhere to be seen. Finally, after a short break, Keith's performance was announced. My heart was ready to jump out of my chest when a tall, skinny teenager came on stage with a violin in his hands. I barely recognized my grandson. The last time I'd seen him at Christmas, he'd been noticeably shorter. Now he stood before me, almost a grown man with a serious face and a straight posture. Keith bowed, raised his violin to his shoulder, and stood still for a moment. And then the music began to flow, deep, heartfelt, and filled with such mature emotion that it seemed impossible that it could have been played by a 16-year-old. I wasn't a great connoisseur of classical music, but even I knew I was in the presence of something special. Keith played with his eyes closed, completely immersed in the music. His fingers flew across the strings with incredible speed and precision in the fast passages, and in the slow passages, he extracted from the instrument sounds of such poignant beauty that many in the audience had tears in their eyes. When the last note sounded, there was a second of absolute silence, and then the hall exploded with applause. People rose from their seats. Shouts of "Bravo!" were heard from all sides. Keith, flushed and a little confused by the reaction, bowed again and again. I applauded until my palms ached, overwhelmed with pride. My grandson, my talented, gifted grandson. How could I let Perry and Octavia deny me the opportunity to see him grow, his accomplishments? After the concert, the audience poured into the foyer, where a small buffet had been organized. The students, still excited from the performance, were receiving congratulations from family and friends. I spotted Keith surrounded by a few kids his age and a couple of adults, apparently teachers. I approached slowly, unsure how he would react to my appearance. But my anxiety was in vain. When he saw me, Keith opened his eyes wide, and then a genuine smile lit up his face. "Grandfather," he exclaimed, making his way through the crowd. "You made it." He hugged me, and I felt how thin and frail he was under his concert suit. My heart clenched. Were his parents not only lying to him about me, but also saving his food, embezzling the money I'd given just for him? "Of course you did," I answered, trying to hide my excitement. "You played great, Keith. I'm so proud of you." He smiled embarrassedly, but there was genuine happiness in his eyes. "Thank you. I called you, but—" "I called you too," I said. "Many times. But your phone was always out of reach." Keith's face darkened. "That's strange. I didn't get any notifications of missed calls." We both knew what that meant, but neither of us said it out loud. "Is there somewhere we could talk quietly?" I asked. "Without unnecessary ears." Keith nodded. "Yeah, let's go to the rehearsal room. Everyone's in the foyer now. There shouldn't be anyone there." He led me down the hallway to a small room with a grand piano, note consoles, and a few chairs. After closing the door behind us, Keith carefully put the violin in its case and sat down across from me. "Grandpa, I'm so glad to see you," he began. "Why did you stop coming to family dinners? My parents say you're angry with them." I sighed. This was the moment of truth. How do I explain to a teenager that his parents have been lying to both him and me for years? "To Keith, there's been a misunderstanding between me and your parents," I began carefully. "But it's not about you. I've always wanted to be a part of your life, to see you perform, to know about your successes." "You have?" There was doubt in his voice. "But Mom and Dad said you always say no when they invite you to my concerts, that you didn't have time." It was so far from the truth that I could barely contain my indignation. "Keith, they never invited me. On the contrary, they've always found reasons why I can't come. The classes are closed, the faculty only. You're too busy to visit." Keith frowned, obviously trying to reconcile the two contradictory versions. But why would they—" He didn't finish the sentence, as if afraid to say the accusation against his parents out loud. "I don't know," I said softly. "Maybe they had their reasons. But I want you to know that I've always wanted to be there for you. I've always been interested in your life, in your music." Keith was silent, staring at the floor. Then he looked up, his eyes wide with confusion. "Grandpa, there's something else. My parents always said that you didn't want to help with my education, that they had to beg you for every pound. It was too much." I felt anger rising up inside me. Not at Keith, of course, but at Perry and Octavia, who had manipulated us both so shamelessly. "Keith, that's not true," I said firmly. "I gave your parents almost my entire pension, often leaving myself only the bare necessities. I believe that this money was for your education, for lessons, for competitions, for an instrument. But my tuition is completely covered by the scholarship," Keith said at a loss. "I won the Mackenzie Scholarship last year. All lessons, even private lessons, are free." "I know," I nodded. "I just found out. I ran into an old friend who works at your school." "Malcolm?" Keith smiled weakly. "He's nice. Always brings me tea when I stay late for rehearsals." "Yes, that's him exactly." I was glad Keith had at least one adult showing genuine concern for him besides me. "Keith, I need to ask, do your parents, do they give you everything you need? For music? For life?" Keith's face darkened again. He was silent for a moment, as if deciding whether to be frank. "Not exactly," he finally admitted. "They always have temporary financial difficulties. I understand, of course. Life is expensive, but sometimes it can be difficult. I need sheet music for additional pieces I want to learn. And the library doesn't always have what I need. Violin strings aren't cheap either, especially good ones. Professor Brown says that with my level of playing, I need quality strings. But, he shrugged, clearly embarrassed to be complaining. And how do you solve these problems? I asked cautiously. I work part-time. Keith brightened up a little. On weekends, I play at Margaret's Cafe by the waterfront. It doesn't pay much, but it's enough to buy strings and sometimes sheet music. I also give music lessons to junior high school students, those who are just starting out. Nothing special, just helping with the basics. I looked at my grandson with a mixture of pride and sadness. So young and already so responsible for his vocation, finding ways to overcome difficulties. And all the while he was saving every penny he earned, his parents were squandering my money that was meant for him. Keith, listen to me. I leaned forward, looking him straight in the eye. All these years I've been giving your parents money specifically for you, for your education, for your musical needs. I thought that money was going to pay for lessons, an instrument, competitions. It's only recently that I found out that your tuition was free, and the money. They were spending it on themselves. Keith turned pale. Are you sure? He asked quietly. Could there be some mistake? I've heard their own confessions, I answered. They talked about it with their friends. They laughed about how easy it was to fool the old man. They were bragging about going to a ski resort in Switzerland with the money they'd bilked from me for an international violin contest. Keith lowered his head, his shoulders slumped. I could see how hard it was for him to accept the truth about his parents. I'm not saying this to turn you against them, I added gently, but you must know the truth. I never refused to help you. On the contrary, I gave the last of it, believing it was for your future. I didn't know, Keith muttered. I swear I had no idea. They always said you were, that you were stingy, that you didn't understand the importance of my education, that they had to literally beg for every pound. And you believed them. It wasn't a question, it was a statement of fact. I had no reason not to. Keith looked up at me with eyes full of pain. We didn't see each other very often. You were always distant. I thought maybe you didn't approve of my choices, my music. Oh, Keith, I felt a lump go down my throat. I've always been proud of you. I always wanted to be a part of your life. It's just that your parents, they put a barrier between us. We sat in silence, broken only by the muffled sounds of voices from the lobby. We were each trying to make sense of the bitter truth and how it was changing our perceptions of the past. What now? Keith finally asked. You're not going to talk to Mom and Dad anymore? I'm afraid so, I answered honestly. I can't forgive them for what they did, for deceiving you, for manipulating you, for turning you against me. What about me? There was anxiety in his voice. Will you communicate with me? Of course, I reached out and squeezed his palm. If that's what you want, I'd really like to be a part of your life, to come to your concerts, to listen to you play, to talk about music, about life, everything. Keith's face brightened but immediately became anxious again. But how? My parents. They won't be happy. That's true, I nodded. Sassari, they've already threatened to stop me from seeing you. They can't stop me. Keith was indignant. I'm 16. I'm not a child. Technically, you're still a minor, I reminded him. They are your legal guardians and can make decisions about who you socialize with. Keith hesitated, drumming his fingers on the violin case, a gesture I remembered from his early childhood when he would think about something intently. We can meet in secret, he said at last. I'm often at school late practicing. I can tell them I'm staying late for extra classes and come to you. Or we can see each other at the cafe where I work part-time. My parents never go there. They think it's too easy for them. The thought of secret meetings with my own grandson was both sad and exciting. It was like we were conspirators in some spy novel, not family. It could work, I agreed. But I don't want you to lie for me. It's not a lie, Keith objected. I'm really practicing late. I'll just do it somewhere else sometimes. Besides, he added with a bitter chuckle, lying seems to be a Winthrop family tradition. I couldn't help but appreciate his dark humor. There's something else, I said. I want to help you, directly, without the intermediary of your parents. Grandfather, no. Keith shook his head. I don't want you to spend money on me. I can do this on my own. I know you can. I nodded. You're strong and resourceful, but that doesn't mean you should refuse help. Do you need quality strings? Some sheet music? Maybe private lessons with some special teacher who isn't on scholarship? I want to give you that opportunity. But parents, if they find out that you're helping me directly, they won't, I said confidently. We can open a bank account in your name. At your age, it's already possible with the consent of an adult relative. I will transfer small sums into it, not so large as to arouse suspicion, but enough for your musical needs. Keith looked uncertain, but there was a glimmer of hope in his eyes. Do you really want to do this? To help me? Achtung, more than anything, I answered sincerely. Everything I've done in the last few years, giving money to your parents, I've done for you. Now I want to help you directly, to see that help actually make a difference. Keith was silent, pondering my offer. Then he nodded slowly. Okay, but only for musical expenses, and only what's really necessary. I don't want you to... I won't go broke. Don't worry, I smiled. My pension will be enough for both of us, especially now that I'm not giving most of it to your parents. Keith suddenly perked up and looked at his watch. I have to go, he said regretfully. My parents have to pick me up in 10 minutes. They didn't come to the concert. They're meeting some friends, but they promised to stop by afterward. Sure, I stood up, feeling my joints ache from sitting so long. I didn't want to get you in trouble. Keith quickly wrote down his real phone number and email address on a piece of paper. It's safer this way, he said, handing me the note. They don't check email, that's for sure. And, can I come to your place next week? I have class until 6 on Tuesday, so I could stop by afterward. I'll be waiting for you, I answered, feeling my heart grow warm. I'll make you something nice. Keith smiled openly, sincerely, like he used to, as a child before his parents' lies came between us. Thank you, Grandpa, for everything, for coming here today, for telling me the truth. We hugged and I felt something inside me heal. Years of loneliness, bitterness, bewilderment, all of it was beginning to recede before the simple joy of being reunited with my grandson. I came out of music school a different person, more whole, more at peace, with a new hope in my heart. I may have lost a son, or rather, I realized I lost him long ago when he turned into a greedy, lying man who manipulated his own father for money. But I had gained a grandson, a talented, honest young man who, despite all the tricks of his parents, retained his affection for his old grandfather. Walking home, I reflected on the strange twists and turns of life. Sometimes you have to lose something to gain something more valuable. Sometimes you have to see the bitter truth to begin building a new, healthier future. And while there would surely be challenges ahead, Perry and Octavia would not give up easily. I knew now that I was not alone in my struggle. It had been 3 months since the day I had reestablished my relationship with Keith. In that time, a lot had changed in my life. I was no longer sitting all day in my small apartment counting every penny. I now had regular appointments with my grandson, new friends from the senior center, and even an old hobby was back in my life. Keith came to see me once or twice a week. Sometimes we just talked about music, about his studies, about his future plans. Sometimes he played for me, right in my small living room, where the sound of his violin filled every corner with light and beauty. At times like these, I could feel Dorothy's presence. She too loved music and would be so proud of her talented grandson. I opened an account in Keith's name at a local bank and transferred a small amount of money there each month. Not so much to arouse the suspicions of Perry and Octavia, but enough so that Keith could buy everything he needed for his music lessons and not spend all his spare time on part-time jobs. I learned from Fiona McLeod that my case of financial abuse was not unique. The Senior Support Center had weekly self-help group meetings for those facing similar problems. I started attending these meetings and found understanding and support there. Some stories were similar to mine, some were much harder. But all of us were united by the desire to regain control over our lives and to protect ourselves from manipulation by our relatives. One day, while looking through newspaper ads, I came across a notice about a meeting of a local amateur radio club. When I was young, amateur radio was my passion. I could sit for hours at the receiver, establishing communication with distant countries, collecting call signs, and exchanging QSL cards. Then work, family, household problems pushed the hobby to the second plan. And after retirement, I just didn't have enough money to maintain the equipment. Everything went to Keith's education. I decided to attend a club meeting, just out of curiosity. I was pleasantly surprised to meet Malcolm and a few other people I knew from the old days. They welcomed me warmly, asked me about my life, and invited me to join their weekly networking sessions. I soon became a regular member of the club and even built a small radio station in my home, partly from parts given to me by new friends and partly from flea market finds. One sunny morning in early summer, I was sitting at my radio, trying to make a connection with an amateur radio operator from Japan when the doorbell rang. It was unusual. Keith wasn't due until the evening, and I wasn't expecting any other visitors. When I opened the door, I was surprised to see Perry and Octavia standing on the doorstep. I hadn't seen them since that memorable day at the restaurant. Perry looked noticeably thinner, and Octavia's face lacked the usual flawless makeup. Both of them were dressed much more modestly than before. "Dad," Perry began, smiling strainedly. "Can I come in? We need to talk." I hesitated. Part of me wanted to slam the door in their faces, but the other part, the part that still remembered the little boy Perry had once been, made me back off and let them inside. They entered the living room looking around with undisguised surprise. My apartment had been transformed over the past few months. There was new furniture, not luxurious, but comfortable and practical. Pictures hung on the walls, mostly of Keith at shows, but there were some with friends from the radio club and the support center. In the corner stood my radio transmitter with headphones and microphone. "Your place is cozy," Octavia said uncertainly, sitting down on the edge of the couch. "And this is a radio station? Have you taken up your hobby again?" "Yes," I answered briefly, not intending to make it easy for them. "Why are you here?" Perry and Octavia exchanged quick glances. Then Perry took a deep breath and spoke. "Dad, we came to apologize. What we did, it was wrong. We deceived you, took advantage of your kindness and generosity. We're sorry." I looked at my son in silence. His words sounded sincere, but something in the expression on his face, something tense, calculating in his gaze, made me doubt it. "We understand that you're angry," Octavia interjected in her honeyed voice. "You have every right to be, but we hope that in time you can forgive us, for Keith's sake, if not for ours." "Ah, that's it, Keith. They used his name to manipulate me before, and they're trying to do the same now." "Speaking of Keith," I said, watching their reactions, "how's he doing? Still doing music on scholarship?" Perry flinched slightly but quickly pulled himself together. "Yes, of course he is. He's so talented. All the teachers love it. But you know, the scholarship doesn't cover all the expenses. Violin strings, sheet music." "Really?" I acted surprised. "I hear the Mackenzie scholarship is pretty generous. It even includes trips to competitions and master classes." Octavia's face paled slightly. She exchanged a quick glance with Perry again. "Well, yes, the basic expenses are covered, but there are extras," he replied evasively. "Kit's growing up. He needs new clothes, better nutrition to keep him strong." "And that's not enough to cover your broker's salary? And the income from Octavia's salon?" I asked bluntly. Perry lowered his eyes, clearly feeling uncomfortable. "Dad, we're having some financial difficulties. Nothing serious, just temporary difficulties with the cash flow." "What a coincidence," I remarked dryly. "Those difficulties began about the time I stopped giving you money, didn't they?" Perry and Octavia were silent, obviously not knowing what to say. "I saw your car in front of the house," I continued. "Not the new Audi, the old Ford. What happened to the Audi?" "I had to sell it," Perry admitted reluctantly. "Like I said, we're having some temporary difficulties." I nodded, beginning to understand the situation. They were used to living large, spending my money on luxuries they couldn't afford on their own income. When that source dried up, their financial house of cards began to collapse. "And you came to me in the hope that I would support you again." It was not a question, but a statement. "No!" Octavia exclaimed too quickly and too loudly. "I mean, Not exactly. We really want to make up, to mend relations. We miss you, Hamish. And Keith misses you too. Keith? I raised an eyebrow. Interesting. I thought you'd forbidden him from communicating with me. Perry tensed. We've never, he started, but I interrupted him. Enough, Perry. No more lies. I talk to Keith on a regular basis. He comes here every week. I've been to 5 of his concerts in the last 3 months. I know what you've told him about me over the years. That I'm greedy, that I don't want to help, that I refuse to see him. Perry and Octavia looked shocked. They clearly hadn't expected me to keep in touch with my grandson. But how? When Octavia hesitated, unable to formulate a question. It doesn't matter, I cut her off. What matters is that your deception has been exposed. Keith knows the truth about how I gave you money for years, believing it was for his education. How you lied to him about me, about how you used us both for your own selfish purposes. Perry jumped up, his face contorted with anger. You had no right to interfere. He's our son. We're his parents. And I'm his grandfather, I replied calmly. And I have every right to communicate with my grandson, especially when he wants to. You turned him against us, Octavia exclaimed accusingly. No, I shook my head. I just told him the truth. Unlike you, I'm not trying to manipulate him or turn him against his parents. I just want to be a part of his life. Perry collapsed back onto the couch, wrapping his arms around his head. Everything's falling apart, he muttered. First the business, now this. What's the problem with the business? I asked, partly out of curiosity, partly to understand the full picture of their financial difficulties. We've lost some big clients, Perry admitted reluctantly. In Octavia's salon, the landlord raised the rent, and we can't afford it. We'll have to close or move to a less upscale neighborhood. And the trip to Switzerland is canceled, I assume. I couldn't resist a touch of irony. Perry gave me an annoyed look. Yes, it is canceled. A lot of things are canceled. We're barely making ends meet. Mortgage, utility bills, Keith's school. Keith's school is free, I reminded him. Not everything is free, Perry snapped. There are extra costs, performance uniforms, travel. That's covered by the scholarship, I finished for him. There was a long silence. They'd come to me hoping to regain access to my wallet, but their plan was falling apart. What do you want us to do? Perry finally asked. Do you want us to crawl on our knees? Beg for forgiveness? Okay, if it'll bring you back into our lives, if you'll start helping again. Perry, I shook my head, feeling more tired and frustrated than angry. You still don't understand. I don't want you crawling on your knees. I don't want to humiliate you or take revenge. I just want to live my life. Without lies, without manipulation, without the constant guilt and obligation to give the last of it. But we are a family, Octavia objected weakly. A family is supposed to stick together, to help each other. Family is not only blood ties, I answered. Family is respect, caring, honesty. You haven't shown any of that to me in years. You saw me only as a source of money, not as a person with feelings, with needs, with a right to a decent life. Perry looked embarrassed, but I could still see the calculation in his eyes. He was looking for an approach that might work, trying different buttons, hoping to find one that would open up access to my wallet. Dad, he began again, in a softer tone. I realized we were wrong. We were selfish, greedy, dishonest. But didn't you teach me that people should be given second chances? Haven't you ever made a mistake yourself? I've made mistakes, of course, I agreed. And I believe in forgiveness, in the possibility of change. But I also believe in sincerity. And right now, I don't see any sincere remorse in you, just regret for losing access to my money. Perry jumped up again, his face red with anger. You think you're so smart, so perceptive, sitting here, judging us as if you were blameless. Who's been practically ignoring their own son for years? Who missed school plays, soccer games, parent-teacher conferences because of his precious job? Who drove mom to exhaustion, forcing her alone to pull the whole house, the whole family while you fiddled with your radio waves? I shuddered. There was some truth in Perry's words. I did work hard when he was a kid. I'd missed some important parts of his life. But it was never out of indifference, just out of a desire to provide the family with a better life. to give my son opportunities I didn't have. You're right, I said quietly. I wasn't the perfect father, and I regret that. But I've always loved you, Perry. Always wanted the best for you. I didn't work so hard for myself, for you and Mom, for your future. Oh, no, and now you refuse to help your only son in his time of need, Perry said bitterly. It's ironic. I'm not refusing to help, I countered. I'm refusing to be used. There's a difference. If you had come to me honestly, told me your problems without trying to manipulate and lie, who knows? Maybe I would have helped. But you keep playing the same games. Even now, when all the cards are out, you try to push pity, appeal to parental guilt, use Keith as a bargaining chip. Octavia rose from the couch and took Perry's hand. Come on, darling. Obviously your father isn't going to help us. We'll manage on our own somehow. It was another manipulation, an attempt to make me feel guilty, to make me change my mind. But I already knew their methods too well. Yes, you can handle it, I agreed. You're both adults, working people. You may have to rethink your lifestyle, give up some of your excesses, learn to live within your means. But it's a rewarding experience. Perry gave me one last bitter look, and they headed for the exit. He turned around at the door. This isn't over, Dad. We'll talk again. After they left, I sat in the chair for a long time, digesting what had happened. Bitterness and disappointment struggled with a sense of release. I felt no satisfaction at their predicament. After all, Perry was still my son, but I knew firmly that I had done the right thing by not giving in to their manipulations. In the evening, Keith came in. He was unusually excited, his eyes shining. Grandfather, I have wonderful news, he exclaimed as soon as he crossed the threshold. I've been invited to audition for the Royal Academy of Music in London. It's one of the most prestigious music schools in the world. Keith, that's wonderful. I was truly happy for my grandson. When is the audition? Next month. Keith sat down next to me and took the Academy's booklet out of his bag. Look at the program, the teachers. If I get in, it'll open the door to the best orchestras in the world. I leafed through the booklet, sharing my grandson's excitement. The Academy really looked impressive. An old building in the center of London, world-famous professors, graduates playing in the leading orchestras. Professor Brown says I have a good chance, Keith went on, but I need to prepare very seriously. The audition program is difficult. Bach, Paganini, Tchaikovsky. You can do it, I said confidently. You have talent, hard work, and a passion for music. That's the most important thing. Keith suddenly turned gloomy. There is one problem, he confessed. Traveling to London, staying there for the auditions, it's expensive. I asked my parents to help, but they said they couldn't afford it right now. They're having some financial problems. I know, I nodded. They were at my place today. Keith looked at me in surprise. Really, they didn't say they were going to see you. I guess they didn't want you to know, I sighed. They came to ask for money, Keith, disguised it as a desire to reconcile, but the true purpose was obvious. And what did you say? I said no, I answered simply. They haven't changed. The same manipulations, the same lies. Keith nodded understandingly. He'd learned a lot about his parents' true nature in the last few months, though I'd never wanted to turn him against them. As for your trip to London, I continued, don't worry about it. I'll pay all the expenses. Travel, lodging, even a new suit for the performance if necessary. Grandfather, I can't accept. You can, I interrupted him gently. And do you know why? Because all these years I've been saving money for just such a purpose, to help you get a better education, to develop your talent. Only the money's been going to the wrong place. Now I can finally put it to good use, helping you directly. Keith's eyes filled with tears. Thank you, he whispered. I don't know what I would have done without you. You would have made it, I smiled. You're strong and resourceful. But I'm glad I can be there to support you. We spent the rest of the evening talking about the upcoming audition, the program Keith was going to do, his plans for the future. For the first time in a long time, I felt truly happy and needed. The next weeks flew by in preparation. Keith came almost every day rehearsing in my living room. I listened, gave advice, even though I didn't understand much about classical music, just supported him with my presence and faith in his talent. Together, we booked train tickets to London, found an inexpensive but decent hotel near the academy. The day before we left for London, when I had Keith for the last rehearsal, the phone rang. I picked up the receiver and heard Perry's voice. "Dad, it's me. We need to talk." "I'm listening," I answered discreetly. "Not on the phone? I want to come over to your place. Alone, without Octavia." I looked at Keith, who was watching me tensely, guessing who was calling. "Now's not a good time, Perry. I've got company." "Keith?" There was annoyance in my son's voice. "He's at your place again?" "Yes, and we're busy. Tomorrow's the big day, a trip to London for an audition." "So you know," Perry said grimly. "And of course you're going to pay for this adventure." "It's not a gamble, Perry. It's a chance for your son to get a better musical education. And yes, I'm helping him because I believe in his talent. And you refuse to help us." The bitterness in Perry's voice was almost palpable. "To your own son." "I'm helping someone who needs and deserves help," I said calmly. "And I use the money for its intended purpose. For education, for development, for the future. Not for trips to ski resorts or buying expensive cars." "You're going to regret this," Perry's voice became menacing. "Someday you'll need help, and we won't be around." "Suckanine, I've already accepted that, Perry," I said without a shadow of regret. "Our paths have parted. You've chosen your path, and I've chosen mine. Is that your final word?" "Yes," I said firmly. "Goodbye, Perry." I hung up the phone, feeling strangely relieved. It was as if the last thread tying me to a past filled with lies and manipulation had finally been severed. Keith looked at me with concern. "Is everything okay?" he asked. "More than okay," I smiled. "You know, Keith, sometimes you have to let go of something to make room for something new. I let go of your father, his lies, his manipulations, and look what I got in return. A real relationship with you, new friends, new hobbies. A life filled with meaning, not constant fear and guilt." Keith nodded thoughtfully. "I understand. And you know, Grandpa, no matter what happens at the audition tomorrow, I've already won, because I found you." We hugged and I felt tears come to my eyes, not from bitterness or disappointment, but from joy and gratitude. Life had taught me a harsh lesson, but it had also given me a second chance. An opportunity to build a new, healthy relationship based on love and respect, not lies and self-interest. The next morning, Keith and I set off for London. A new chapter of our lives was ahead, full of hope, plans, and real, genuine support. I didn't know if Keith would get into the academy on his first try, but I was sure of one thing. No matter what happened, we would get through it together. Because a real family is not those who are bound only by blood, but those who are bound by heart, honesty, and mutual respect.